Great. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's really lovely to be here with all of you. Welcome to today's conversation about change. We're going to be talking today about what I call new structures, old habits, or why we put so much time and effort into making change happen, and then we still do all the things we used to do, and we're not really sure why that happens. So hopefully in today's, 15-minute or so conversation, you'll walk away with some really tactical, practical tools to help you with that. No worries, Cassie. Glad to have you here, even if it's partial. So just to get started, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julia Monahan. I am an organizational development practitioner, and my work helps to center the human experience inside nonprofits and philanthropic organizations. And I do that by supporting equity-driven organizational transformation and participatory strategy. And so as part of my practice, one of the things I've been doing for the last 9 months or so is these mostly monthly webinars on topics that I am either spending a lot of time on in my work, or I'm seeing as patterns across my clients, or things that I think are relevant and timely to the sector as we navigate what has been a very strange couple of years. And so if you enjoy today's conversation, I do these, like I said, monthly or bi-monthly, kind of depending on the season. And so I'm always glad to have you join future discussions. What we'll be doing today is diving into helping us as nonprofit leaders and nonprofit managers and nonprofiteers understand why sometimes we put all this time and effort into designing a change for our organizations and why that change doesn't stick, and coming up with some people-centered, because that's kind of my focus, is how we work in ways that center that human experience to help changes hold. So not just putting all this time and effort into designing change, but actually seeing that change come to life. And so in service of that purpose, I'm hoping we'll be able to explore a bit about why structural changes don't produce the results. We identify some of the categories of work that are required to help change stick, and to discuss some practical approaches for how you can lead that change in your own systems. Let's dive in. So we're here to talk about where change efforts don't get us. Come on, we're clicking here. Where change efforts don't get us where we expected. We're going to talk a little bit about why change doesn't get us where we expected. So I've supported tons of organizations. I've lived in organizations. I'm sure you have lived in organizations, or maybe you're living in one right now, where we've invested in trying to do something differently. And we put a lot of time and effort into thinking about what do we want different to look like, and what does that process look like, and what does that mean in terms of our org chart, and what does that mean in terms of our job descriptions and strategic plans and all these things. And often those changes don't stick. We put all this time into designing the change, but we don't see the change play out in real life. We've all heard that old McKinsey statistic that 80% of change initiatives fail. And so in the systems that I've been in, or the systems I've worked in, I feel like we tend to reach for one of two explanations when this happens. The first thing we reach for is, we must have designed the change wrong. Whatever vision we had or whatever structure we had, we just must have not gotten it right. We must have made a mistake. It must have not been the right fit. Whatever that might be. Something about what we designed is wrong. That could be true. Might not always be true. The other thing I hear a lot, and to be honest, this is kind of what got me, this is what led to the name of my current practice, people-centered change. What we often reach for is we tend to blame people. We tend to say, people just don't like to change, or people are resistant to change, or nobody wants to get on board, or we have all these ideas about people not wanting to be helpful in the context of change. One thing I joke with clients is, in change management, we have this idea of like resistors, and we talk about people who resist change like, they're a cabal of like mustache twirling villains that like meet in the basement and come up with plans for like, how can we help this change fail, and maybe they've got a naked cat that they're petting. I don't know. And so we have these ideas of people sort of actively resisting change or choosing not to participate. And we say, well, that must be why the change isn't working, because we've got this like these bad actors who just don't want things to succeed. And I think that both of these answers, maybe they're true sometimes, but I think they fundamentally tend to fail us when we're looking for the real answer why change doesn't stick. Dive into what I think is some of the missing layer in some of this change management work that I think all of you just surfaced. In my experience, it's enabling behavioral change that's the missing layer. We design the structure, we design the outcomes, but we don't look at the behavior shift that needs to happen and how behavior change happens to get us there. So we define our intention through these structural design choices, but behavior is the mechanism that gets us to the actual results, and we just don't look at that. We say, hey, here's the new future, please do this instead. And that might work if your organization is made up of robots, but as far as, today, at least, I think most of us are still human beings in warm, complicated bodies, which means it's not that easy to say, oh, just start doing things differently. And so I see implementation getting reduced to what I call the mechanics, the job descriptions, the new performance review systems, the new SOPs, the new process documentation, but we're not actually looking at what it takes for people to change the way they think and change the way they behave in that system. And so if we think about bridging that gap, I think there are three categories of behavioral adoption work that require attention if we want a change to succeed. The first is the work that I think I'm personally most passionate about, and that is understanding and honoring what change asks of people. So again, if we recognize that we're human beings and not robots, there's no switch inside us that we can just flip. Change is a cognitive demand, it's an emotional demand, and it's a relational demand. These things are all required in order for us to function differently. And if we act or pretend like we're not asking that of people, we're not giving them space, giving them tools to negotiate that, to manage that, which means they don't have the conditions to succeed. So that's one category, and I'm going to talk about all these more in detail. The second category of behavioral adoption work that I see a need for is creating the conditions that make that new behavior automatic, creating scaffolding so that it's easy to do the new thing, and ideally even easier to do the new thing than it is to do the old thing. And then finally, and a bunch of you named this in our check-in, making sure that you are leading the change through your own behavior as a leader, that you are modeling what you are that you're modeling what you're expecting of others so that you are the standard. And so that there's the conditions for accountability there, so that if that's not the case, you're able to get that feedback. So those are the three categories of work that I'm going to talk about in the next, 20 minutes. So let me talk first about recognizing and honoring what it takes to actually change. And like I said, this is the piece that I am most passionate about, and I think we are the most likely to ignore in change management processes. And so I want to spend a bit of time here. Change is demanding on us as individuals. It's cognitively demanding on our brains and our brains' resourcing, and it is emotionally demanding on who we are as people. And I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. On the cognitive side, our brains are designed to function in a pattern formation, pattern following kind of way. That's how neural pathways work in our brain. The more we do something, the more specific neural pathway in our brain is reinforced, the easier it is for our brain to follow that pathway, the fewer resources it takes for our brains to follow that pathway. Because our brains are constantly seeking cognitive efficiency, it means our brains always want to opt to the pathway that costs the fewest resources. This is why changing habits is so hard, because once those pathways are built, our brain is like, I don't want to pay the price to take the harder road. I want to pay the cheaper price to take the easy road. So when our conditions change, or when what we need to do changes, we are asking our brain to spend more resources, from attention, from our working memory, from our emotional and cognitive capacity to make those shifts. It is physically, not just emotionally, physically more demanding on our brains. We're more tired at the end of the day. We're more likely to run out of resources, executive functioning resources, midday, if we're trying to push our brain to do new things. And that's just one new thing. But as some of you mentioned in the check-in, when we've got multiple changes that we're trying to juggle at the same time, this compounds the cognitive that we're being asked to make can feel disproportionately hard, because we're sending all these cognitive resources to all these new places, trying to keep up with all these new demands. So this is just physically difficult for us to do. And I think what's important in the moment that we're in is that we are not living through a stable moment in time as a country, as human beings, as a sector. There is so much that's changing around. Change. Our brains are already juggling all these wider contextual changes that we're putting new resources into trying to manage. And then my boss wants me to do this new thing differently. Like, that might be the thing that just absolutely sends me over the edge. And my brain is like, no, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We're all out today. Check back tomorrow. Although tomorrow might not be so different. So there's just a lot of physical demand on us in the context of change. And if we don't recognize that, we get frustrated as leaders when we're like, this isn't so hard. Why aren't people doing it? Well, it's harder than it looks. It's not just about filling out a new form. It's about building those neural pathways and what that costs us. The flip side are what I call the psycho-emotional demands of change, which is how change feels to us as people. And while the cognitive piece is pretty consistent person to person, while some of our brains are wired in ways that help us manage change better than others, for the most part, we all experience those things. These psycho-emotional demands can vary a lot person to person, and can vary a lot depending on the change context. But almost every change involves some kind of loss. Even if you're moving toward something that is new and exciting and that you're jazzed about, there's still something that you are stepping away from that we don't often acknowledge, that we don't often give credit to. That loss might be something as simple as a familiar routine, but it might also be a bigger loss. Like, maybe I'm working with new people, and that means I'm stepping away from old relationships. I might be doing something that I've never done before, which means I'm not as competent at it. And so I'm losing that sense of competence that I had, that maybe I put a lot of value into. Or maybe just the old thing that we had was easier for me, and now I'm stepping into something harder, and so I'm losing the sense of comfort. No matter what the change is, there is something that we're losing, and that loss, we don't talk about it a lot. It might not be big enough to feel like we can talk about it, but it's real and it draws on us. And as we move through change, there's the way things were, there's the way things will be, but the change process exists in what this practitioner William Bridges calls the neutral zone, the space in between where we haven't yet built the thing that we will have. And so we're kind of like figuring it out as we go along. There's a lot of ambiguity in the neutral zone. There's a lot of uncertainty in that neutral zone. And for a lot of us, ambiguity and uncertainty are really challenging, both cognitively and emotionally. We like to know what's coming so that we can feel prepared, so that we can feel safe. When we don't know what's coming, that can feel really unmooring. And again, we're living through a context that is really uncertain nationally, globally, within our communities. And so we are compounding that when we're creating change in our organizational systems. So we're living through a lot of uncertainty right now. That's really hard. The flip side is creative. We don't yet have something new. We're building in real time. And so there, for some of us, this can be a chance to really lead in and take advantage of that uncertainty to build something new. But that requires that I'm functioning in a system where that's safe to do, where trial and error is safe, where failure is safe, where working out of the box a little bit is safe. And if I'm not in a system that enables that, that can be emotionally demanding too. I might have ideas, I might see opportunities, but I don't feel safe enough to bring them forward. And so that can be really taxing. So cognitive demands, emotional demands. What this tells me about resistance is, if we think again about that, cabal of mustache twirlers in the basement, the reality is that most of the time when we talk about people who are resistant, what we're really saying is there are people in our system who are afraid, who are uncertain, who are cognitively overloaded and just don't have the resources to do everything we're asking of them, who navigate uncertainty with difficulty. That's what we're saying. We're saying resistors are really just folks who are struggling in this moment. And we can either choose to villainize them, or we can choose to create supports to help them succeed. When we villainize them, we just damage our trust with those folks and we make change adoption harder. No one wants to be made the villain when I'm already feeling uncomfortable or scared or fearful or whatever it is. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it can look like in practice to support people cognitively and psycho-emotionally. So the first thing that I think is so critical is to name the experience, is to acknowledge as leaders, this is what's happening. We know this is difficult. We're not going to pretend this isn't difficult. We're going to acknowledge that for some of us, this is a really exciting time, but for some of this might be really challenging. Doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We still have to do it, but we don't have to pretend that it's easier than it is. There's so much power in naming things, in validating other people's experiences. This creates space for people to engage with that reality. And that might mean creating space for people to process the change, to talk about how it's feeling for them, for people to ask questions, for people to voice concerns, for people to give feedback. Not just once, not just in a change kickoff town hall, but in an ongoing way to say, hey, I was feeling okay, but this new shift is hitting me in this way. I need this support, or I have this concern. So how do we make sure that there's this ongoing dialogue happening at this level of the change, not just the process and structure piece, but the how is this impacting people? The third thing that I think is really important here is recognize that people and teams move through change at different speeds. So depending on your individual resilience, your own, to Jerry's point, home life and what's happening for you outside the organization, what's happening to all of us in our broader context, our own histories, we're all going to move through change and experience change differently. So in a given organization, you're going to have some people who are speeding through the change because they're real excited about it and they adapt really easily and quickly. And we're going to have some people who are going to need more time. And so recognizing that that's happening in your system and creating opportunities to both engage the early adopters and give them space to run and to ideate and to experiment, while also recognizing that some people are going to need more supports if they're moving through really slowly. Dorothy, that's such an interesting question. Dorothy's asking in the chat, how do we know when a change process is over? One of the very early change practitioners that informed a lot of the work that we do in the OD field, Kurt Lewin, talked about the change process as a 3-stage process: freeze, change, unfreeze. No, sorry, unfreeze, change, refreeze. The idea being that we have a system, it's frozen in place, we find out how to unfreeze it, we make the change, and then we set the new change in place by freezing again. I think everybody, and so by that model, we would know, oh, well, once we've kind of frozen everything in place, we're good. I think modern change management recognizes that like that's a fantasy, and change is happening all around us all the time. It's iterative, it's dynamic. And so when you think about a bigger scale change, like, oh, we're restructuring, oh, or we're building a new department, or moving into a new strategy, we might set some milestones that tell us, hey, we've achieved what we intended to achieve with this. But I would say that change is an ongoing process of adaptation and learning, especially in today's organizational context, which means it might not ever be over, if I'm so sorry to say. So continuing to think about what it looks like in practice to support people through this behavioral shift cognitively and emotionally. The fourth thing I tend to focus on is how do we create consistency where we can? So we know that folks struggle with ambiguity, struggle with uncertainty, and that is inherent in a change process. We can't get away from that. But where can we create consistency and create certainty so that folks have the resilience for what the unpredictability we can't control? And so that might mean from a change process standpoint, we make commitments like, we're going to be announcing decisions within 48 hours of when they're made, or there's going to be an update every Friday about where we're at in the process, or before we make this kind of change, we're going to make this kind of announcement. Give people certainty as much as possible so they're not left wondering about the things you can control, so that they're only wondering about the things you can't control. That opens up capacity and resilience. The last thing I want to touch on when it comes to supporting people cognitively and emotionally is planning for the neutral zone, meaning recognizing that when you've got this in-between period where you're in the middle of change, recognize that that is a hard time for folks. Recognize that you're not going to be able to plow through it. Recognize that it could be that we're going to see performance dip at this time, that we might see morale dip during this time, that people aren't going to be as effective as they ordinarily are. I've worked with leaders who have said things like, everyone's talking about how busy they are, but we're not that busy as an organization. What's everybody doing? They're managing the cognitive load of change. That takes resources, that takes time. And so recognize that you're not going to be at the top of your game. You're not going to be nailing all of your performance metrics when you're in the midst of a big change, because folks aren't capable of it. So plan for that. Don't let that be a surprise. And then we suddenly wonder why we're not meeting targets that we promised a donor that we hit, or we're not meeting financial goals that are essential to our cash flow. Like, if possible, plan around that so that you've got some flexibility so that folks can take the time they need to move through the change process. So I want to pause here before I shift into the next of the three kind of categories of work. Any final reactions or questions about what it takes to support people cognitively and emotionally as they move through behavior change? And thanks for putting up with the audio delay. I appreciate it. And if you like the neutral zone, the author who came up with that concept, his name is William Bridges. He has a great book called Transitions, which in part I like because it is incredibly readable. It's not academic at all. I think it's a great read for any leader, not just someone who's leading change. So if that concept is exciting to you, you might like his other work.
What's the author again?
William Bridges.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. So a couple more buckets of work that I'd love to. The next is thinking about how to create the conditions that make new behaviors automatic. So we've got an old way of doing things, old way. We already talked about how from a cognitive standpoint, it's really difficult to shift to a new pattern. So how do we make that shift easier? How do we make that shift well supported? And I want to give you some examples of what I mean here. If you, for example, one of the changes you're looking to make is to help people make decisions without having them escalate it to the next level of leadership. Make decision-making criteria explicit. Support people's ability to make those decisions in the moment so they don't get escalated. If you're trying to promote cross-functional collaboration, book the meetings, create the cross-functional group, and put a block on the calendar every week or every other week so that the space is there, so that people don't have to think about, oh, when are we going to get together with this team? Create the structure to make that happen. If you want people to be one thing I work with teams a lot on is like, oh, how do we use our meeting time more efficiently? We don't want to be updating each other in meetings. We want to be collaborating, but when do the updates happen? Oh, maybe they should be in writing. That's a whole new habit to build. Maybe create a template that everybody can use so that those written updates are easy to populate every week or every month, and you're not thinking about how to structure them. If you're looking for people to, if you're trying to create a culture where people raise concerns early versus waiting until they become a real catastrophe, build in a standing prompt to your regular meetings to say, hey, does anyone have any concerns they want to flag before we move forward? Build it into your process. So all these things I'm giving here are examples of what I call scaffolding. They might not be practices that you have to do forever, but they are tools you can use to help your team build new muscles to do new things automatically. This scaffolding might require a lot of deliberate effort upfront, but the goal is that as that new thing becomes the new habit, becomes the new norm, the scaffolding can kind of fall away. So an example of this is if you've, I'm sure many of you have heard of the RACI model or the DACI model, or there's like ORPI model, all these different models of decision-making authority. And when I've used these models with clients, one of the questions I get is like, oh, do we have to fill out this decision-making template for every decision we make for the rest of all time? No, the idea is you use the template for the next 3 months, the next 6 months, until talking about decisional accountability becomes built into your language as an organization. Then you don't have to use the template anymore because the habit is ingrained. The template is just scaffolding. Another example might be a template for supervision check-ins that prompt questions around strategic plan alignment. If you're trying to get everybody kind of rowing in the same direction, do you need to do every supervision meeting from now until the end of time with the template? Maybe not, but this is going to help you get into the habit of asking certain kinds of questions. This might mean scheduling routine check-in meetings on progress towards certain goals so that you're getting into the habit of checking in on something. It might mean building a standing agenda for certain kinds of cross-functional meetings until they get into the habit of collaborating around certain things or talking about certain things. So really here it's about what kind of upfront structures can we put in place temporarily that make the new thing easy and kind of just like automatic to do until our own sort of cognitive autopilot takes over. And so that's really the question we're answering. What upfront supports are going to make the new behavior easier than the old behavior? Let me pause there again and see if anyone has questions or reactions or maybe examples. If you've been in an organization where there has been change, are there examples of scaffolding like this that have worked really well for you? All right, I'll keep rolling. Thanks again for your patience with the bad audio, with the slow audio rather. So just continuing to think a little bit about this scaffolding process. When we think about a new structure or a new way of doing things, part of what we're also talking about here is thinking about what I call the connective tissue that brings the pieces of the new thing together, that makes them function. So in an org chart, the connective tissue might be How do we think about collaboration across teams? How do we think about cross-functional teams? How do we think about performance management between levels and accountability and decision making between levels? Those are all the pieces that help that new structure work. And all this has to be built deliberately in any kind of change you're moving toward. If we're implementing a new strategic plan, we've got new strategic goals. Okay, well, how do we connect the new goals to the existing work of our teams? How do we make sure that they have goals that ladder up to those strategic goals? And so there are kind of three categories of this scaffolding that you can be thinking about that might be appropriate for different kinds of change. So one might be infrastructure. So thinking about, repositories, information repositories, documentation systems, communication platforms. What are the structural ways in which we're helping this change happen? The example I gave before about getting certain meetings on the calendars or certain standing agendas. These are all different examples of infrastructure that help that change come to life. Then we've got norms. And this is more about how we agree as a team to work together to get things done. So how decisions get communicated, how we use meeting time, how we collaborate, how we disagree, how we give and receive feedback. All of those are norms that you can build explicitly. You can say, hey, in service of this new thing that we want to be doing, we recognize that we have to work together differently to achieve that. Let's talk about what those differences are. And then the final piece, which we'll talk about more in the last section, is around feedback and accountability. How do we make sure that we're giving ourselves opportunities to notice when are things working in the way that we had hoped, and how do we kind of give ourselves kudos for that? But how do we recognize when things are drifting or aren't happening in the way that we hoped? And what are the feedback mechanisms that are in place to help hold us accountable collectively as well as individually? Jerry, I like your point about some connective tissue being more organic. Absolutely. There's so much informal work that happens in organizations across people, across systems that help us achieve things. Some of those things leaders can put parameters around, but some of them happen organically and are really a function of the effectiveness, I would say, of your culture and leadership and overall performance. So the last thing I want to say about behavioral adoption is that this sort of scaffolding period, it's not a moment in time, right? Like it's not as a part of our change process, we're going to spend a day talking about new behaviors, and then we've kind of checked off that box. This scaffolding idea really reinforces that you're talking about a period of sustained intentionality where you're helping people, give people tools and systems and practices that are going to help them do the new thing. It means we're putting resources behind it. It means we're protecting our time, we're protecting our calendars, so that we're able to opt into new ways of doing things. Tried and true method for setting a norm around how people flag concerns. What I would say is, to me, that is rooted in how an organization, what their culture of feedback looks like, and what kind of norms they've established around who gets to give feedback to whom, and where is their accountability in terms of how that feedback is received and managed. And so I would take a step back and say, part of successful change is also about setting clear expectations around how feedback is given and received, which I'll talk about more in a sec, but I'd also welcome other folks to jump in if they have thoughts on that, because that's a big one. The last thing I think we're all naming here is that leadership accountability is kind of the key here. You can have all kinds of bottom-up change initiatives inside an organization, but there's a lot of potential for change to fail when folks who hold positions of power aren't on board or aren't willing to kind of be the change that they're trying to operationalize across a system. And so, as leaders, one of the things I tell folks is that your behavior is the strongest signal in this system as to whether or not this change is real. If you're telling people you want them to do something and your behavior does not mirror that, what you are saying is this isn't real. We're not really doing this. This is just wallpaper. And so, what this can look like from a leadership standpoint is leaders overriding a decision that maybe they've delegated. Maybe they're too nervous about the stakes. Maybe they've got a specific way they want to see it done, whatever it is, that overriding, holding up a process because you're not comfortable with what that process calls for of you. And so you're the bottleneck because stepping into that next thing is feeling too scary. Maybe you as a leader are moving too fast. And so you're not doing the bridging work that's bringing people along with you. You're just kind of skipping to that next phase and not recognizing the work that needs to be done in between. Or maybe you're great at, unintentionally or not, saying exactly the right thing in a meeting or in a town hall, but then your day-to-day behaviors default to the old stuff for all the reasons that we've talked about, right? Like change is hard. Unfortunately, it requires that you be more successful than everybody else in the room because that's kind of part of your job. And a key piece of all of this, which we've been talking about throughout this session, is making sure that accountability doesn't just flow from leaders to staff, but creating systems for accountability to flow toward leaders to say, either broadly, I don't think this is working, or have you noticed that you've said X, but what you're doing is Y? And there being a system in place for that to be okay to say. Jerry, I love your point here about leaders being candid about the awkwardness of change. So when we talk about creating space, as I talked about earlier, like naming the difficulty, there's also a moment for leaders to say, I'm a human being too, and I'm sure I'm not going to get this right. That's okay. We're all doing this together, but I'm committed to getting it right, and I want you to give me feedback when I get it wrong. Systems of bottom-up accountability. What does that look like? I think it starts with openness from leaders to hear that accountability, right? Because it's very challenging for there to be bottom-up feedback in a system where it's known that that kind of feedback isn't safe. So if there's fear of retaliation or fear of, I'm going to get blowback, I'm going to get something as a result of this, you're not going to be able to have that bottom-up feedback. So ideally, you have a partnership in place at all levels of the system where it's understood that bottom-up feedback is welcome. And then you can have anonymized systems, you can have group discussions where that kind of feedback is actively solicited. And I'm happy to talk more about that. I'm just going to kind of rush to the last slide, but I'm happy to talk more about that because I think that's critical. I apologize that I'm rushing through these last couple slides, but I just want to close by saying that from a change standpoint, as we've been talking about all along, as things are changing, we need to stay responsive. We have to recognize that change is ongoing and iterative, and that it's going to land differently for different people. You want to be designing for difference in identity and lived experience, recognizing that's a big factor in how people experience change. It has been really lovely getting to spend this hour with you, even though my internet was clearly not cooperating. I apologize that I'm not able to do a little bit more Q&A at the end, which I typically like to do. But I really appreciate everybody participating in today's conversation. I hope you found it valuable. I always welcome feedback. It helps me do better work. And so there's a link here to share feedback about what you found useful here and other topics you'd like to see me focus on. And if you're in the midst of a change process where you're like, I think this is stuck and I'm not sure why, I've built an assessment tool that I would be more than happy pro bono to help you run in your organization to try and get at the root of like what might be holding us up. And so if that's something that you'd be interested in doing with me, there's a link here. It'll guide you to scheduling a 30-minute conversation with me on my calendar, and we can talk about what it would look like to deploy this assessment in your system. So I'd be happy to help you do that. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here. I wish you the very best remainder of your Thursday.